Good evening. Find a comfortable position and let the room go quiet. If you are lying down, let your shoulders drop. If you are sitting, let your hands rest wherever they are comfortable. There is nothing you need to do for the next couple of hours except listen, and if you fall asleep somewhere in the middle, that is not a failure. That is the point. Tonight, friend, we are going to London. Not the London of postcards and red buses, but the London of gaslight and coal smoke and horses, where the fog came down the river in the winter and settled in the streets like something with weight to it. The year is 1862. It is January, and it is cold, and the entire country has gone black. I do not mean that as a figure of speech. Black armbands on the postman, black crape wound around the door knockers, black cloth draped over shop fronts along Regent Street, black-edged notepaper in every stationer's window in the city. In December of 1861, Prince Albert died at Windsor Castle at the age of 42, and his widow put on mourning and did not take it off for the next 40 years. And a nation that already had very firm ideas about how grief ought to look took those ideas and made them into law. Not law you could be arrested for breaking, something worse. Law you could be quietly and permanently ruined for breaking. Somewhere in Islington tonight, in a narrow brick house on a terrace of identical narrow brick houses, a woman is sitting up late doing arithmetic she does not want to do. Her husband has been dead for 9 days. She has 2 children asleep upstairs and a housekeeping book open in front of her, and she is trying to work out how she is going to afford to look sad enough. That is where we are going. Take a breath. Let the day you have had finish itself somewhere else for a while. We have time, and we are going to use all of it. Tonight we are going to follow a widow through a single ordinary day in the winter of 1862, from the moment she wakes to the moment the last candle goes out. And we are going to look very closely at what Victorian mourning actually required of a woman. Not what it symbolized, but what it cost her to comply with, in fabric and hours and money and rules. The version you probably carry in your mind is almost entirely wrong. That version is a painting. A pale woman in an elegant black gown, standing beside a window with one hand on the sill, gazing into a middle distance full of noble sorrow. She is beautiful and composed and slightly tragic, and she has clearly never once had to ask what any of it cost. The real one had to ask, constantly, because Victorian mourning was not a mood, it was a purchase, repeated on a schedule, enforced by neighbors and priced by an industry that understood exactly how little bargaining power a woman has 9 days after her husband's funeral. By the time we are finished tonight, you will know 3 things you almost certainly do not know now. You will know what the black actually cost, in shillings and in pounds, measured against what a household like hers had coming in. You will know what the fabric did to the women who wore it, which is a great deal more than being uncomfortable. And you will know what the rules took from her, that had nothing to do with clothing at all, which is the part that never makes it into the paintings. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of evening that suits you, if you like history that feels like a place you can walk around in rather than a set of dates to remember, would you consider subscribing? It helps more than you would think, and it is the reason these keep getting made. And if you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where you are listening from and what the weather is doing outside your window. I read them, and I like knowing. Wherever you are, I am glad you are here. Now, it is the 14th of January, 1862. The sun has not come up yet, and in a house on a terrace in Islington, a woman named Charlotte Ames is already awake. Before we go into that house, we should walk the streets around it, because the city she lives in explains a great deal about the rules she is about to obey. London in January of 1862 is the largest city in the world, and it is growing faster than anyone quite knows how to manage. Something like 3 million people live inside it, and more arrive every week from the countryside and from Ireland and from the continent, looking for work in the docks and the workshops and the vast machinery of clerical labour that keeps an empire's paperwork moving. The city has swallowed villages whole. Islington, where Charlotte lives, was farmland and tea gardens within living memory. Now it is streets. The first thing you would notice if you stepped out into it is the air. Everything in this city runs on coal. Every house burns it. Every workshop burns it. Every locomotive and steam engine and factory burns it. And the smoke comes out of 500,000 chimneys and has nowhere to go. On a still winter morning, it sinks. It mixes with the river fog and turns the color of weak tea. And it gets into the fabric of your coat and the back of your throat and the corners of every window frame in the city. Londoners call the worst of it a particular. Later generations will call it a pea super. On the days when it settles properly, you cannot see the far side of a street, and the shops light their lamps at noon, and the sound of the city changes because the fog muffles it. So the horses and the wheels and the voices all come to you softened and slightly wrong, as though the city has been wrapped in wool. The second thing you would notice is the noise. Iron-rimmed wheels on granite sets make a sound that modern ears have never heard. A continuous grinding clatter that never entirely stops, day or night. Add to that the horses. There are tens of thousands of them in London, hauling omnibuses and cabs and brewers' drays and coal carts and the private carriages of the wealthy. And every one of them produces a great deal of manure, which is swept into heaps by crossing sweepers, most of them children, who clear a path across the road so that a lady can cross without ruining her skirts, and who hold out a hand afterward, hoping for a coin. The third thing you would notice in January of 1862 is the black. Prince Albert died on the 14th of December. He was 42 years old. The court physicians called it typhoid fever, and modern doctors have argued about that diagnosis ever since, proposing everything from Crohn's disease to an abdominal cancer that had been quietly killing him for months. Whatever it was, it took him quickly at the end, and it left Queen Victoria at 42 herself, a widow with 9 children and a reign that still had 4 decades to run. What happened next is the reason we are here tonight. The court went into mourning, which was normal. The court went into the deepest possible mourning, which was also normal for a consort. And then the court simply stayed there, month after month, year after year, while the Queen withdrew from public life so completely that she would eventually be criticized in the newspapers for it, and given a nickname by Rudyard Kipling that stuck to her for the rest of her life: the Widow of Windsor. But in January of 1862, none of that has happened yet. In January of 1862, the country is 1 month into a national mourning that feels genuinely, spontaneously enormous. Albert was not universally loved during his life. He was German, he was serious, he was disliked by large parts of the aristocracy for being humorless and interfering. In death, all of that evaporated. The public grief was real, and it was everywhere, and it was visible. Walk down Regent Street in the second week of January, and you will see it in the shop windows. Black cloth swagged across the frontages. Black-bordered mourning cards and black-edged writing paper displayed where the ordinary stock used to be. Drapers advertising black silks and black crepes and black bombazine in the newspapers, in advertisements that had been set in type within days of the announcement from Windsor. And in the middle of Regent Street, at numbers 247 and 249, stands the building that will matter most to Charlotte Ames tomorrow morning. It is called the London General Mourning Warehouse, though nobody calls it that. Everybody calls it Jay's, after William Chickle Jay, who opened it in 1841 and who understood something about grief that most people prefer not to think about, which is that it arrives suddenly. It arrives with a deadline, and it arrives at a moment when the person experiencing it has neither the time nor the composure to shop carefully. Jay's began as a modest shawl shop. By the 1860s, it had expanded across several large units of Regent Street and employed something in the region of 600 people. And it sold not merely mourning clothes, but the entire apparatus of Victorian death. Coffins, hearses, mourning stationery, black-bordered handkerchiefs, household mourning for the servants, a staff who would come to your home and take charge of the arrangements so that the bereaved family need not trouble themselves with the details. It also, and this is the part worth sitting with, published its own guidebook. Jay's commissioned a book called A History of Mourning, written by Richard Davey, which explained to the reading public what mourning had meant across cultures and centuries, and, in the process, explained to the reading public what mourning ought to look like now. A company that sold black cloth also published the authority on how much black cloth a respectable person required. Nobody at the time appears to have found this strange. Jay's was not alone. Peter Robinson's mourning warehouse stood on the same street. In New York, there was Jackson's. In Philadelphia, there was Besson and Son. And in Paris, the Maison de Deuil served the same function for the same reasons. Mourning was an international industry with an international supply chain, and in the first weeks of 1862, that industry was having the single best quarter it had ever had, because the entire British Empire had gone into black at once. And the timing of that, if you step back from it, is remarkable. Albert died in December of 1861. The American Civil War had begun in April of the same year, and would go on to kill somewhere in the region of 600,000 people over the following 4 years. The mourning customs that Victoria's widowhood was hardening into orthodoxy in Britain crossed the Atlantic into a country that was about to need them on an industrial scale. And the American mourning trade expanded through the 1860s for reasons that had nothing to do with any royal household and everything to do with casualty lists. 2 of the great engines of 19th century mourning culture fired within 8 months of each other on 2 continents, and the fabric to serve both of them came largely from the same mills in Essex. Look sideways from Regent Street too, because the mourning economy was not only a matter of shops. The undertaking trade in London in this period was substantial and, by the standards of any era, aggressive. A funeral was sold in grades, like everything else, and the grades were designed so that each one visibly outranked the one below. At the top end, there were plumed horses, hired mutes standing at the door with long staves draped in crape, feathermen carrying trays of black ostrich plumes, mourning coaches, and a hearse with carved and gilded panels. At the bottom end, there was a cart. The point of the ladder was to make each rung uncomfortable to stand on, and undertakers were entirely open with families about what the neighbours would think of each option. Charles Dickens loathed all of it, and said so repeatedly, and left instructions in his own will that his funeral be conducted in an inexpensive, unostentatious, and strictly private manner, that no one attending wear a scarf, or a cloak, or a black bow, or a long hatband, and that any such absurdity be avoided. That instruction is worth remembering, because it tells you that the criticism was not a later generation's hindsight. There were people at the time, prominent people, who thought the whole apparatus was grotesque, and who said so in public, and who were entirely unable to stop it. Because underneath the industry sat the thing the industry could not have manufactured on its own, which was fear. A Victorian family's respectability was not a permanent possession. It was a status that had to be continuously demonstrated, and it could be lost. There was no safety net worth the name. Below respectability lay the workhouse, and below the workhouse lay the pauper's grave. And every family in a street like Charlotte's knew exactly how few reversals it would take to get there. In that world, the sums spent on funerals and mourning looked less like vanity and more like insurance. What you were buying, underneath the plumes and the crape, was the continued belief of your neighbours that you were still the sort of people who could afford them. Which brings us to the economics of the street where Charlotte lives, And here, the numbers are worth pausing over. Islington in 1862 is not poor, and it is not rich. It is the geography of the lower middle class, the clerks and shopkeepers and commercial travellers and minor professionals who occupy the anxious ground between the working class below them and the comfortable class above. The houses are brick, 3 stories with a basement kitchen, arranged in terraces along streets that were fields a generation ago. They are leased, not owned. A house like Charlotte's costs somewhere between £40 and £50 a year in rent. A clerk in a solicitor's office, which is what her husband was, might earn somewhere between £150 and £200 a year, depending on his seniority and his employer's generosity. Edward Ames was chief clerk to a firm in Gray's Inn, so he was at the upper end of that range. Call it £180. Out of that comes the rent, the coal, the food, the school fees for the children, the clothing, the doctor when the doctor is needed, and the single live-in servant that a household of this class must keep in order to remain a household of this class, rather than something less. That servant, a maid of all work, earns perhaps £12 to £16 a year, plus her food and her attic room. She does everything. She lays the fires, blacks the grates, carries the coal, hauls the water, scrubs the steps, cooks the meals, washes the linen, and answers the door. There is one of her, and there is a great deal of house. This is the ledger. £180 coming in, and every shilling of it already spoken for. And into that ledger, in the second week of January 1862, arrives a bill for mourning. We will get to the exact figures later tonight, because they deserve their own unhurried explanation. For now it is enough to know this. A complete set of first mourning for a widow, done properly, could cost more than a year of that maid's wages. It had to be bought immediately, because a widow could not appear in anything else. It could not be economized on visibly, because the entire purpose of the fabric was that everyone could see what it was. And it could not be reused, because the crape wore out, and because there was a widespread superstition, taken seriously in a great many households, that keeping mourning clothes in the house after the mourning period ended would invite another death into the family. You bought it, you wore it out, you got rid of it, and then you bought it again the next time somebody died. That is the machine. And in a house on a terrace in Islington on the 14th of January 1862, a woman is about to be fed into it. The house is the fourth from the end. There are railings at the front and 3 steps up to a black painted door, and on that door there is a knocker that has been wrapped in black crape and tied so that any caller who lifts it makes a muffled sound instead of a sharp one. The blinds in the front windows are drawn down. They have been drawn down for 9 days. Inside, the front parlour smells of cold ashes and beeswax and the flat staleness of a room that has been kept shut. There is a clock on the mantelpiece that was stopped at 4:20 on the morning of the 5th of January and has not been restarted. There is a mirror above it, and the mirror has been covered with a cloth. Upstairs, on the first floor, at the front, there is a bedroom with a bed that has 1 person in it instead of 2. She has been awake since 5. Her name is Charlotte Ames, and she is 34 years old. She is not a real person, and I want to be straightforward with you about that, because it matters. Charlotte is a composite, built out of the household accounts, etiquette manuals, letters and probate records that survive from women exactly like her. Every rule she follows tonight was a real rule. Every price she pays was a real price. Every physical sensation she describes was documented by someone who felt it. What I have done is gather those pieces into one woman so that we can follow them through a day instead of reading them in a list. Her circumstances are ordinary to the point of being statistically typical, which is precisely why she is useful. She was born Charlotte Wren in 1827 in Norwich, the second of 5 children of a wool merchant whose business was comfortable without ever being grand. She was educated at home and then briefly at a day school for young ladies, where she learned French she has mostly forgotten, Needlework she still uses constantly, and enough arithmetic to keep a household book, which turns out to have been the most useful thing anyone ever taught her. She married Edward Ames in 1850 when she was 23 and he was 28. It was not a grand match, and it was not a desperate one. He was a solicitor's clerk with prospects, she was a merchant's daughter with a small settlement, and their families were satisfied on both sides. What the families could not have predicted, and what Charlotte would have found difficult to explain to anyone who asked, is that she liked him. Not in the swooning way of the novels she occasionally read and mostly disapproved of. She liked his company. She liked that he explained things to her without condescending, that he read aloud badly and knew it and did it anyway, and that when he was worried about something at the office, he told her about it instead of retreating into the study and pretending nothing was wrong. They had 4 children. 2 survived, which in 1862 is not a tragedy so much as an average. Roughly 1 child in 6 died before their first birthday in England in this decade, and in the crowded districts of the great cities, the figure was considerably worse. Charlotte lost a daughter at 11 months to what the doctor called convulsions, and a son at 3 days to nothing anyone could name. She keeps a lock of the daughter's hair in a small paper packet in the bottom of her workbox. She has never had it made into anything. The 2 who lived are upstairs asleep. Emily is 9, serious, and reads more than her mother thinks is good for her. Thomas is 6, and has recently discovered that he can make his sister furious by repeating the last word of everything she says, a discovery he is exploiting with the total commitment of a small boy who has found his life's work. The household also contains Ruth Pargeter, who is 19, from Bedfordshire, and who has been the maid of all work here for 2.5 years. Ruth gets up at 5:30, lays and lights the kitchen fire, and works until she is sent to bed, which is usually somewhere around 10. She is paid £14 a year. She is fond of the children, tolerates Thomas's current phase better than his mother does, and has been crying quietly in the scullery at intervals since the 5th of January, partly for Mr. Ames, whom she liked, and partly because she is 19 years old and does not know whether this household will still exist in 6 months, and if it does not, she will need a new place and a character reference from a woman who may not be able to give her one. Edward Ames died on the 5th of January 1862 at 4:20 in the morning of a fever that came on quickly after Christmas and did not let go. He was 39. He was buried on the 10th at Abney Park, which is where people of his exact social position were buried, and the funeral cost £11 and 4 shillings, which Charlotte has written in the housekeeping book in the same neat hand she uses for the butcher's bill, because she does not have another hand, and it did not occur to her to invent one. That housekeeping book is the single most important object in this story. It is a plain quarto volume, half-bound in dark cloth, and Charlotte has kept one continuously since the first week of her marriage. Every entry is dated. Every column is ruled by hand. Rent, coal, candles, meat, bread, milk, fish, vegetables, servants' wages, school pence, boots, doctor, sundries. 12 years of a life recorded in the only terms in which a Victorian wife had unambiguous authority. There is one other thing in the house that belongs entirely to her. On the shelf beside the bed there is a small green volume of Tennyson. It is In Memoriam, published in 1850, the long sequence of poems the poet wrote over 17 years after the death of his closest friend. Edward gave it to her in the first year of their marriage, because it was the fashionable gift of the moment and because he had no idea what else to give a wife who read. She found it heavy going at 23. She has read it 3 times in the last 9 days. She is not the only widow in England doing that this month. Queen Victoria is said to have found real comfort in the same book after Albert's death and to have told the poet so herself. Somewhere in Charlotte's mind, without her quite articulating it, sits the knowledge that the woman at Windsor and the woman in Islington are reading the same lines in the same winter for the same reason, and that this is the closest the 2 of them will ever come to occupying the same room. Her responsibilities as of this morning are these: She must keep the household running, which she has always done, but now on an income that does not exist. Edward's salary stopped on the 5th of January. There is a small life assurance policy which will pay out something in the region of £200 once the paperwork clears, and which is the only reason she is not already writing to her brother in Norwich. There is the possibility of a subscription got up by Edward's firm among the partners and senior clerks, which is how these things were often handled, and which is entirely at their discretion. There is her settlement, which produces perhaps £18 a year. That is the whole of it. She must arrange the disposal of Edward's clothing and effects, which she has not begun and cannot yet face. She must decide whether Emily continues at her day school at a cost of £6 a year. She must decide whether to keep Ruth. And she must, before anything else, before the practical questions and the legal questions and the terrible arithmetic, present herself to the world in the correct clothing. Because, until she does that, she cannot answer a caller, attend a church service, walk down a street, or transact any business whatsoever without being noticed and discussed. This is the part that modern instincts get wrong, so it is worth being precise about it. The mourning clothes are not the last item on the list, to be dealt with once the important things are sorted out. They are the first item. They are the precondition for everything else. A widow in the wrong clothes is not a widow who has made a fashion error. She is a widow whose respectability is in question, and in 1862, a woman's respectability is the collateral against which every other thing in her life is borrowed. Her credit with the tradesman, her standing with her neighbours, her children's marriage prospects 15 years from now, her ability to ask her late husband's employer for help without the request curdling into something shameful. She knows all of this. She has known it since she was a girl, in the way you know the rules of a game you have been playing your entire life without ever being formally taught them. Yesterday afternoon, she wrote out a list on the back page of the housekeeping book. It is headed in her small, upright hand, Mourning. Beneath it, she has begun to itemize what she will need, and beside each item she has left a blank column for the price, because she does not yet know what any of it costs. She has never had to buy first mourning before. Her parents are alive. Her babies were too small to require anything of her but grief. Today she will find out. She has been awake since 5, lying on her side in a bed that is too large, listening to the house. At 5:30, she heard Ruth on the back stairs. At 5:45, she heard the kitchen fire catch. A little after 6, the first cart went past on the road outside, and she counted the wheels without meaning to. At 6:20, because there is no longer any reason to lie there, Charlotte Ames pushes back the covers and puts her bare feet on a cold floor. The day begins. The room is cold in a way that modern houses have forgotten how to be. There is no fire in the bedroom, and there has not been one since Edward's illness, when there were fires everywhere, and the coal bill for December ran to nearly £2. The window is single glazed, and there is frost on the inside of it, feathered across the lower panes in patterns that Emily will want to look at later. Charlotte's breath is visible. She washes at the washstand in water that Ruth brought up last night, and that has been sitting there ever since, which means it is somewhere just above freezing. This is normal. She does it quickly, with a flannel in sections, the way every woman of her class does it in January, and her skin goes red and then numb. Then she dresses, and this is where the day changes. For 9 days she has been wearing an old black silk. It was made 4 years ago for her mother-in-law's funeral. It has been let out twice since, and it is, in the language of mourning etiquette, entirely inadequate. Black silk has a sheen. It catches light. In the first stage of mourning for a husband, a widow is required to wear fabric that does not catch light at all, and there is exactly one fabric that satisfies this requirement completely. It is called crape. Charlotte does not own any yet. That is what today is for. But she has seen it her whole life, on other women, and she knows precisely what she is walking toward. so let us look at it properly before she does. Crape, spelled with an A when it refers to mourning, is a silk gauze. It begins as waste silk, the short, broken fibres left over from producing better cloth, which is the first thing worth knowing about it. It is then woven loosely, dyed black, and passed between heated, engraved rollers that crimp it permanently into a crinkled, pebbled surface. Finally, it is stiffened with gum or starch or glue so that it holds that texture and hangs in a particular dead, papery way. The crimping and the stiffening together do the essential job. They break up the surface so completely that light hitting the fabric scatters instead of reflecting. Crape does not shine, and it cannot be made to. It absorbs. A woman in full crape in a lit room reads to the eye as an absence, a shape where the light stops, and none of that is an accident of manufacture. It is the specification the fabric was made to. Somebody sat down and engineered a cloth that would make a human being look like a hole in the world. It is also, by any standard, unpleasant to wear. It is stiff, and it scratches. Its crimped surface catches on the skin of the wrists and the throat. It has no drape and no give, so a crape skirt does not swing. It swings against you. It sheds a fine dust, constantly, which we will come back to later tonight in some detail, because that dust is the reason this fabric belongs in a story about danger, and not merely a story about discomfort. And it is ruined by water, completely and immediately. Rain spots crape, and the spots do not come out. Damp air makes it go limp and lose the crimp. A woman in crape who is caught in a London shower has not been inconvenienced. She has destroyed an item that cost her more than her servant earns in a month, and she will have to buy another, and everyone will know, because the ruined patches are visible from across a street. Think about what that does to a person's life. And I mean her life, and not just her wardrobe. In a city where it rains on roughly half the days of the year, the correct mourning fabric makes going outdoors a financial risk. It does not forbid a widow from leaving the house. It simply makes leaving the house expensive, unpredictably, and lets her work out the rest for herself. She stays in. Of course, she stays in. But that is tomorrow's problem, and next month's problem. This morning, Charlotte puts on the inadequate black silk because it is what she has, and she fastens it at the wrists with fingers that are clumsy from the cold, and she pins her hair without looking in the glass because the glass is covered. The covering of mirrors is one of those customs that survive long past the belief that produced it. The original idea, going back centuries and found across a great deal of Europe, was that the soul of the newly dead might become trapped in a reflection, or that a mourner who saw themselves might be marked next. By 1862, almost nobody in a house like this one would defend that literally if you pressed them. They do it anyway. Charlotte covered the mirrors on the 5th of January because her mother covered them, and her grandmother covered them, and because on the morning your husband dies, you do not want a set of household customs to argue with. You want a set of instructions. That is what ritual is for, and it is one of the very few kind things this system does. The stopped clock is the same. 4:20, the hour he died, frozen on the mantelpiece. It will be restarted when the household comes out of the deepest phase of mourning. Until then, it sits there being wrong, and every visitor who glances at it learns something without having to ask. Charlotte goes downstairs. The staircase is narrow and turns twice, and the treads creak in 3 places that she could name in her sleep. On the ground floor, the passage is dark because the front blinds are still down. She goes past the closed parlour door, past the closed door of the small back room that Edward used as a study and that she has not opened since the 8th, and down the last flight into the basement kitchen, where there is light and heat and Ruth. The kitchen is the only properly warm room in the house between now and the evening. The range is lit, there is a kettle on it, and the air smells of coal smoke and hot iron and yesterday's bread. Ruth is at the table in her working dress with her sleeves pushed up, and she stands when Charlotte comes in, which she has done every morning for 2.5 years, and which Charlotte has stopped noticing. They talk about the day. This is a business conversation conducted between two women with a wide gulf of class between them and a great deal of practical intimacy across it. Ruth reports what is in the larder. There is bread, there is butter, there is the end of a piece of bacon, there are eggs, there is tea, and the milk will come at 7. Charlotte says they will have the bacon this morning and asks Ruth to make the eggs go to the children. Ruth says there is no need for that, ma'am, and Charlotte says there is, and neither of them says anything else about it, and the matter is settled in the way such matters are settled, which is to say, the mistress has instructed the servant to notice nothing, and the servant has agreed to appear to comply. Charlotte takes her tea standing up, which she has done every morning since the 5th, because sitting down at the kitchen table feels like admitting something. At 7, the children come down. Thomas arrives first, and at speed, because he is 6 and does not yet understand what has happened in any way that slows him down. He understands that his father is dead. He has been told, carefully, twice. What he does not understand is that this is permanent, and so he oscillates without warning between ordinary 6-year-old cheerfulness and sudden, total, howling grief, sometimes within the same minute, and there is no predicting which is coming. Emily arrives second, and quietly. She is 9, and 9 is old enough. She has taken on, in the last week, a stiff and terrible competence, carrying dishes she has never carried before, telling Thomas to be quiet in a voice that is a startlingly accurate copy of her mother's, and asking no questions at all about what is going to happen to them, which worries Charlotte far more than questions would. They are both in black. This is not optional either. Children were expected to be put into mourning, though the rules for them were looser than for adults, and their clothes had been dealt with in the first 2 days by the simplest and commonest method available to a household with no money to spare, which was dyeing. You take the clothes the child already owns. You put them in a copper of hot water with a commercial dye, and you boil them, and you stir them with a stick, and you hang them to dry, and what comes out is black, or something adjacent to black. Ruth did it on the 7th, in the scullery, over the course of an entire day, and the whole house smelled of it, and the water that went down the drain afterward was the colour of ink. This is the poor woman's version of mourning, and it is worth understanding exactly what it involved, because the commercial dyes available to a household in 1862 were not benign. The blacks were built on logwood, on iron salts, on chromium compounds used as mordants to fix the colour, handled in an open copper, in a closed scullery, over hours, by a 19-year-old with no ventilation and no gloves. They produced fumes and splashes and stained hands that took a fortnight to come clean. Ruth had a headache for 2 days afterward and did not mention it to anyone. The dyed clothes have another problem, which is that they are not colour-fast. Emily's dyed frock has already begun to leave grey marks on the inside of her collar and on the skin of her neck when she gets warm. Thomas's has done worse, because Thomas gets warm constantly. Charlotte has noticed. She has not said anything, because there is nothing to say and no money to fix it, and because the frocks only have to last until spring. Breakfast is bread and butter and tea, and the eggs, and the bacon divided in a way that Charlotte manages without appearing to manage it. Thomas talks the whole way through it, and Emily does not say a word. Charlotte asks Emily whether she slept, and Emily says yes, in a tone that closes the subject. At 7:30, the postman comes. This is the moment the morning changes gear, because the post in 1862 is not what the post is now. London has multiple deliveries a day. Letters written in the morning are answered in the afternoon. The postal service is the nervous system of middle-class social life, and a death sets off a cascade through it that arrives in waves for weeks. There are 5 letters. Charlotte takes them into the cold parlour to open them, because the parlour is where correspondence is dealt with, and because she does not want to read them in front of the children. 3 are letters of condolence, and all 3 are on black-bordered paper. The border is a code, and like every other part of this system, it is precisely calibrated. A very wide black border indicates the writer is in deep mourning themselves. A narrower border indicates a lesser degree of connection or a later stage. A person writing to a bereaved household is expected to use bordered paper, and a person who writes on plain white paper to a fresh widow has committed an error that will be noticed and remembered. Charlotte reads them. One is from her sister in Norwich and is warm and practical and says she will come in February. One is from a neighbour 3 doors down and is kind and slightly formulaic. One is from a woman Charlotte has known for 11 years and is so stiff and so correct and so obviously composed with an etiquette manual open on the desk that Charlotte reads it twice, trying to find the person she knows inside it, and cannot. The fourth letter is from Edward's firm. It expresses the deepest sympathy of the partners. It notes that the late Mr. Ames was held in high regard. It states that his salary has been made up to the 5th of the month, and that a cheque for the outstanding amount is enclosed. It says nothing whatsoever about a subscription or a pension or continued assistance of any kind. Charlotte reads this one 3 times as well, for entirely different reasons. The 5th letter is a bill from the undertaker for the balance outstanding on the funeral. She sits down in the cold parlour with the letters in her lap and the covered mirror above her and the stopped clock beside it, and for about 90 seconds she does not do anything at all. Then she gets up, takes the letters through to the back room, opens the housekeeping book, and writes down the figure from the undertaker's bill in the sundries column in her small, upright hand. At 7:45 there is a knock at the door, the muffled kind because of the crape on the knocker. It is Mrs. Pierce from 3 doors down, and she has not come to visit because visiting is not permitted. She has come to leave something, which is permitted, and she has brought a covered dish. This is one of the decent parts of the system, and it deserves saying so. In the first weeks after a death, a bereaved household in a street like this one received food. Not as charity, which would have been an insult, but as a practical acknowledgement that the kitchen of a house in mourning is not going to be functioning properly. The dish is a pie. Mrs. Pierce hands it to Ruth at the door, says a few words, does not come in, and goes. Charlotte hears the whole exchange from the back room and does not come out, because coming out would put both of them in the difficult position of having to conduct a conversation neither of them is supposed to have. She listens to the door close. Then she goes into the kitchen and looks at the pie on the table and finds, unexpectedly and quite badly, that this is the thing that undoes her, and not the letter from the firm. It takes her about 4 minutes to get herself back. Ruth, who has seen the whole thing, becomes extremely occupied with the range and does not turn round once, which is the kindest thing anyone does for Charlotte Ames this week. Afterwards, there is the morning's actual work. A house of this size, in this era, does not run itself, and although Ruth does the heavy labour, the mistress of the house does a great deal more than modern imagination usually credits. Charlotte's ordinary morning involves the ordering, the accounts, the mending, and the direct supervision of everything that is not routine. Today it involves all of that, plus the machinery of death. She goes through Edward's papers for 40 minutes, which she has been putting off. In the desk in the back room, she finds the assurance policy, which is what she was looking for, and the lease, and a bundle of receipts, and a folded sheet on which he had been working out, in pencil, whether they could afford to send Thomas to a better school in 3 years' time. He had written figures in 2 columns and had not finished. She puts that sheet in the drawer of the desk and closes it. She writes 3 replies to the condolence letters, black bordered paper, which she does not have, so she uses plain paper and adds a border by hand in ink along the edge, which is a thing women did and which everyone recognized as the mark of a household that had not yet been able to get to the stationer. She is aware of what it signals. She does it anyway, because the alternative is not replying, and not replying is worse. She gives Ruth the day's orders. There will be no butcher this week. The bacon will do, with the pie, and there is a bone that will make a broth. Ruth says nothing about this either. And at 9 o'clock, she does the thing she has been dreading more than the shop, which is that she goes upstairs to the back bedroom and tells Emily that she will not be going to school this week, and possibly not next, and that she is not to worry about it. Emily says, "All right, Mama." Then Emily says, "Is it because of money?" Charlotte has about a second and a half to decide how to answer that, and the whole of Victorian parenting doctrine and a good deal of her own upbringing says that the answer is a reassuring evasion. What she actually says is, partly, yes. Emily nods and goes back to her book, and neither of them says anything else. And Charlotte goes downstairs, understanding that her 9-year-old daughter has just been let into the adult world, and that there is no way of letting her back out again. It is 10:15. She has been awake for 5¼ hours, and she has to be on Regent Street by 11. Now, the economics of this world deserve their own unhurried explanation, because Charlotte is about to spend money she does not have, and the only way to understand why she does it is to understand what the numbers actually were. Start with the fabric itself, because the fabric is where the money goes. Crape was the product of one company to a degree that is unusual in industrial history. The firm was Samuel Courtauld and Company, based in Essex, and by the middle of the 19th century, it was the dominant producer of mourning crape, not merely in Britain, but in the world. Courtaulds mechanized the crimping process, drove the cost of production down, scaled the output up, and exported aggressively to the United States and to France. It was, in practical terms, a monopoly on the one fabric that respectable grief required. Here is the detail that changes the picture entirely. Crape was made from waste silk. The short, broken, otherwise low-value fibers left over from the production of better cloth. It was cheap to make, and it was sold at a very high markup indeed, on the entirely reasonable commercial logic that a woman purchasing first mourning is not in a position to shop around, compare prices, or wait for a sale. During the boom years, Courtaulds is recorded as earning a return on capital in the region of 30%. That is an extraordinary figure for a textile manufacturer in any era. It was built on a cheap input, a captive market, a fabric that wore out quickly, and a social convention that made buying it non-negotiable. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy and satisfying to say that the mourning industry invented the rules in order to sell the cloth, and that is not quite true. The customs were older than the companies. What is true, and what the record supports, is something more interesting and rather more uncomfortable. The industry did not invent the rules. The industry standardized them, published them, advertised them, and made them more elaborate and more expensive than they had been before. And it did all of this while presenting itself as merely a helpful servant of established custom. Jays published the authoritative guide to mourning and sold the goods the guide described. Nobody had to conspire. The incentives did the work. So what did it actually cost? A widow's first mourning, done to the standard that etiquette required, was not a dress. It was an outfit, and then a second outfit, because you cannot wear one dress every day for a year, and then everything else. She needed at minimum 2 dresses of black bombazine or parramatta, entirely covered or heavily trimmed in crape. Bombazine is a twilled cloth of silk warp and worsted weft with a dull, matte finish, and it was the standard body fabric of deep mourning. Parramatta was its slightly lighter cousin. Over that went the crape, and the amount of crape was itself a signal. In the deepest stage, the skirt might be covered in it almost to the waist. She needed a mourning bonnet, made in black crape, with a widow's cap beneath it. She needed the veil. We will come to the veil. She needed black gloves, and she needed several pairs, because gloves wear out, and a widow cannot be seen in a mended pair. She needed black stockings, black boots or shoes without shine, black bordered handkerchiefs, a black shawl or mantle for the cold, and an entire set of undergarments which, and this is one of those small details that tells you how deep the system ran, remained white throughout. The black was for the world to see. Underneath, nothing changed. She needed jewelry that was permitted, which in the first stage meant jet and essentially nothing else. And then, because the household mourns and not merely the widow, she needed to put her children in black, which we have seen, and she needed to put her servant in black, because a household of any pretension was expected to provide mourning for its domestic staff, and a maid answering the door in a coloured print dress 9 days after the master's death would have been a small scandal in itself. Add it up, and the figures that survive from the period suggest that a full outfitting of first mourning for a middle-class widow ran somewhere in the region of £15 to £25, depending on how thoroughly she did it and where she bought. Set that against the ledger we established earlier. Ruth earns £14 a year. The rent is £45 a year. The entire household income, now that Edward's salary has stopped, is £18 a year from Charlotte's settlement, plus whatever the life assurance eventually yields. Charlotte is about to spend more than her servant's annual wage on clothing that she will wear out and then be obliged, by superstition and by fashion, to get rid of. And here is the part that makes the whole structure visible. She has to spend it now. Not when the assurance money clears. Now, in the second week, while the callers are calling and the letters are arriving and the neighbours are watching, because the entire function of first mourning is that it is immediate. A widow who appears in correct mourning 3 weeks after the funeral has announced to everyone that she could not afford it in the first week. So how did women do it? Some had credit, and the mourning warehouses extended it generously for reasons that require no explanation. Some borrowed from family. Some had a burial club or a friendly society, working-class institutions that took a few pence a week and paid out a lump sum on a death, and which existed precisely because the cost of dying respectably was ruinous. Some pawned things. The pawnbroker is a permanent fixture of 19th century working life, and the traffic through the doors of a London pawnshop in the week after a death in the neighbourhood was a thing contemporaries commented on, and a great many, like Ruth in the scullery with her copper of dye, simply boiled what they already owned and hoped that at a distance it would pass. There is a whole grim sub-economy here. Second-hand mourning was sold in the markets and the old clothes shops of Houndsditch and Petticoat Lane, which meant that the poorest mourners were often wearing crape that had already been worn by 2 or 3 other bereaved women, dust and all. Dye recipes circulated in household manuals and in the domestic columns of women's magazines. One etiquette guide of the period includes a recipe for removing black dye stains that is itself dangerous enough that the guide advises having a pharmacist mix it rather than attempting it at home, which is a remarkable thing to find inside a book about good manners. There is one more piece of this economy, and it is the piece that sits least comfortably. The women who made the crape. Courtaulds employed a substantially female workforce in its Essex mills, and the work of producing, dyeing and finishing crape put those workers in daily contact with the dyes and the fumes and the fibres at concentrations far beyond anything a customer experienced. The 19th century textile industry generally was not a healthy place to work, and the specific processes involved in mourning crape combined hot dyeing, chemical mordants, and a fine particulate dust that hung in the air of the finishing rooms. So the chain runs like this. Broken silk fibres that were worthless for anything else. Young women in an Essex mill breathing dye fumes for long hours at low wages. A Regent Street warehouse with 600 staff and its own published etiquette guide. And at the end of it, a widow in Islington handing over more than a year of her servant's wages for the privilege of being visibly, correctly, absorbently sad. Every link in that chain was legal. Most of it was considered admirable. Jay's was regarded as a respectable and well-run establishment, Courtaulds as a great industrial success, and the whole apparatus as evidence of a society that took the proper observance of grief seriously. And this is the part of the story that rarely gets told. The Victorians did not think of any of this as exploitation. They thought of it as decency. That is what makes it worth 2.5 hours of your evening, because a system that everyone involved believed was kind is a far more interesting thing than a system everyone knew was cruel. For Charlotte, none of this analysis is available. She has no idea what Courtaulds' return on capital is. She has never heard the phrase captive market. She simply knows that she has to go to Regent Street this morning, that she has, perhaps, £12 she can lay her hands on immediately, that the list on the back page of her housekeeping book is longer than £12, and that she is going to have to make choices in a shop, in front of an assistant, about which parts of her grief she can afford to display. It is 9:15. She puts on her bonnet. She walks to the omnibus because a cab from Islington to Regent Street would cost the better part of 2 shillings, and she has decided that is money she will not spend today. The walk takes 11 minutes. The pavement is greasy with the winter London compound of mud, soot, and horse traffic, and Charlotte holds her skirt up with one hand in the manner every woman of this era learns before she learns to write. It is not raining, which is the single piece of good fortune in her mourning, but the air is heavy, and the sky over the rooftops is the colour of a dirty coin. She notices, walking, how many other people are in black. Some of it is for Albert, and some of it is for their own dead, and there is no way to tell the difference, which is a strange thing to think about. A month ago, a woman in full black on a public street was a specific statement about a specific loss. Today, she is one of hundreds, and Charlotte finds she has complicated feelings about that, which she does not have time to examine, because the omnibus is coming. The omnibus is a horse-drawn box with wooden benches down both sides, 12 inside and more on the roof for those willing to climb, and it costs 3d to Oxford Circus. Inside, in January, it is dark and damp and smells of wet wool, straw, and the collective breath of a dozen strangers. There is straw on the floor for the mud. The windows fog immediately. Charlotte sits with her hands in her lap and her eyes down and does not speak to anyone, and nobody speaks to her. Because a woman in black is a woman who is not to be spoken to, which is the first small mercy the system offers, and one she is grateful for this morning. She gets down at Oxford Circus a little after 10 and walks south into Regent Street. Regent Street, in 1862, is the finest shopping street in the world, and it knows it. It is a great curved sweep of stucco-fronted buildings with a colonnade of shops at street level, built 40 years earlier by John Nash as a deliberate act of urban theatre. And it is where the wealth of an empire comes to look at things it might buy. The pavements are crowded. Carriages stand at the curb. Shop windows are lit from within, even at mid-morning, because the January light is not up to the job. And this month, a great deal of Regent Street is draped in black. Jay's occupies numbers 247 and 249, and by 1862 it has spread well beyond those two addresses. The frontage is imposing. The windows are full of black, arranged with the care of a museum display. Bonnets on stands, bolts of bombazine and parramatta laid open in folds to show the weight of the cloth. Crape falling in dead vertical lengths that do not catch a single point of light. Charlotte stands outside it for a moment longer than she needs to. Then she goes in. The interior is warm, which is the first shock. The second is the quiet. Jay's is not a hushed cathedral of grief exactly, but it is noticeably subdued compared to the drapers she is used to. Voices are low. The assistants move without hurrying. There is a smell that she will remember afterwards and never quite be able to describe, made of new cloth, dye, dust, gaslight, and the faint, sweetish tang of the gum used to stiffen crape. An assistant comes to her within 30 seconds. This is a woman of perhaps 40 in an unrelieved black dress of her own, and she is very good at her job. And her job has 2 parts. The first is to identify within moments the exact social and financial position of the woman in front of her. The second is to sell her as much as that position will bear. She does the first part while asking Charlotte how she may be of assistance. She looks at the 4-year-old silk that has been let out twice, the bonnet that has been retrimmed, the boots, the gloves, and the way Charlotte holds her reticule. and she arrives at a conclusion that is accurate to within about £20 a year. Then she says gently that Madam has our very deepest sympathy and asks whether it is for a husband. Charlotte says yes. Everything after that is choreography. They begin with the body of the dress, and the assistant lays out bombazine and parramatta and explains the difference in a tone that manages to be informative without ever being condescending. Bombazine is heavier, wears longer, and is what a widow would traditionally have. Parramatta is lighter and more comfortable and rather more modern. The bombazine is more expensive. The assistant does not say the bombazine is more correct. She does not have to. She simply lets a small pause sit after the word traditionally, and Charlotte hears it. They move to the crape, and here the conversation acquires a second layer that Charlotte can hear perfectly clearly and cannot do anything about. The question is not whether she will have crape. The question is how much. And the amount of crape on a widow's skirt is a public number. Crape to the hem only is the minimum. Crape halfway up the skirt is respectable. Crape almost to the waist, with crape on the bodice and the sleeves, is what a woman does when she wishes to make it unambiguous that her grief is complete. The assistant does not push. She does not need to. She lays out the options, says what each would require in yards, and lets Charlotte do the arithmetic in her own head while standing at a counter under a gas lamp in a warm shop full of quiet, well-dressed women. Charlotte chooses the middle option, and she feels the choice as a small, specific, private failure that she will think about again at 2 a.m. several times over the following months. She is aware that this is absurd. She is aware that Edward, who was a sensible man who worried about money, would have told her to buy the cheapest thing in the shop and have done with it. She chooses the middle option anyway, because the assistant is watching, and because the woman at the next counter is watching, and because Mrs. Pierce from 3 doors down will see the finished dress on Sunday. Then they come to the veil. The widow's veil, sometimes called the weeping veil, is the single most important object in this entire story, and it is worth slowing down for. It is a full-length veil of crape, worn over the bonnet and hanging down over the face and often to the waist or below. In the first stage of mourning, a widow was expected to wear it down over her face whenever she was in public. And I mean down, not folded back over the bonnet the way it gets shown in paintings. Down, between her face and the world. What that means practically is this: she cannot see properly. Crape is opaque enough that a veil down over the face reduces vision to a dim, crimped blur, and women of the period complained constantly about tripping, about misjudging curbs, about not recognizing people they knew. She cannot breathe freely because she is inhaling through a stiffened, gummed fabric held a few inches from her mouth. She cannot be seen, which means she cannot be read, which means her expression is her own for the first time in her adult life. And a number of women recorded that they found this a relief. The women's magazine Madame Demarest's Quarterly Mirror of Fashions wrote in 1862 that the veil allowed a widow to weep with propriety. That is the entire logic in 4 words. The veil is not there to protect the widow. It is there to protect everyone else from the sight of her. Charlotte holds a length of it. The assistant has draped it over her hand to show the weight. It is lighter than it looks, and stiffer than it looks. And when Charlotte moves her fingers underneath it, the fabric makes a dry, rustling sound, like a paper bag, or like something in a hedge. She buys it. While the assistant is writing up the order, Charlotte stands to one side and does what anyone does in a shop when they have a few minutes and nothing to occupy them, which is look at the other customers. There are perhaps a dozen women in this part of the shop. One of them is very young, no more than 20, and she is with an older woman who is doing all the talking. And the young one has the blank stillness of someone who has not slept and is not entirely present in the room. One of them is expensively dressed, and is being attended by 2 assistants at once, and is discussing crape trimming in the tone of a woman choosing curtains, which either means she is not much grieved, or means she is holding herself together by treating it as a domestic task. And there is no way to tell which from the outside, and Charlotte catches herself judging and stops. And in the corner there is a woman of about 50 who is buying almost nothing. A pair of gloves and a length of ribbon. She is being served politely and briskly, and she will be out of the shop in 4 minutes. And Charlotte understands, without anyone saying anything, that this woman has come to Jay's because Jay's is where you go, and that she will be doing the rest of it at home with a copper and a packet of dye, and that the gloves and the ribbon are what she can manage of the real thing. The whole social hierarchy of grief laid out across one shop floor at 11:40 on a Tuesday morning. Then there is the fitting, which takes 20 minutes behind a curtain with a fitter who has pins in her mouth and who is extremely competent and completely impersonal. Charlotte stands with her arms slightly out from her sides while the ready-made bodice is chalked and pinned at the waist and the shoulders. She is thinner than she was in December. The fitter notes it without comment and takes it in. There is a mirror in the fitting area, and it is not covered, and Charlotte has not seen her own face in 9 days. She looks at herself for about a second and a half, and then she looks away again. The final total is £18, 7 shillings and 6pence. She has £12. She opens an account, which the assistant offers before Charlotte has to ask, and which is the reason Jay's did such extraordinary business, and she signs her name, Charlotte Ames, in a ledger, and she notices that her signature looks wrong because she has not written it since the 5th, and every previous time she wrote it, there was a Mr. Ames somewhere in the world. The made-up items will come by the 10th of February. The ready-made dress, altered, and the bonnet and the veil and the gloves will be delivered to Islington tomorrow. It is 12:20. She does not go straight home. There is one more errand, and it is the one she has been carrying at the back of her mind all morning, like a stone in a shoe. 2 streets away, there is a jeweller, and in the window of the jeweller there is a card of mourning brooches, and Charlotte goes and stands in front of it in the cold. The rule in first mourning is jet, nothing else. No gold that shows, no coloured stones, nothing that reflects. Jet is fossilized wood, mined principally at Whitby on the Yorkshire coast, and it is black and matte and light enough to wear in quantity, and after Albert's death the Queen required jet at court, which fixed it as the only wholly acceptable mourning stone and turned Whitby into a boom town. At its height, the Whitby jet trade employed well over 1,000 people in a town of a few thousand, carving brooches and beads and bracelets for a market that could not get enough of them. Beside the jet in the window there is something else. Hairwork. There are perhaps a dozen pieces, brooches with a compartment of glass, behind which a lock of hair has been arranged into a tight plait, or a woven lattice, or a shape like a wheat sheaf, or a miniature landscape painted with ground hair and gum on ivory. There are watch chains braided from hair, thick and glossy and startlingly like the real thing because they are the real thing. There are rings with a channel of woven hair running around the band. Charlotte has a paper packet in her workbox at home with a lock of her daughter's hair in it. She has a lock of Edward's, cut on the 5th of January by the woman who laid him out, folded into a piece of writing paper and put in the drawer of the washstand. She stands in front of the window for a long time. Then she walks to the omnibus stop without going in, and she could not tell you why. And we will come back to that this evening. Before we follow Charlotte home, there is something worth understanding about what that veil was doing to the women who wore it, because this is the part of the story where a social custom stops being merely oppressive and starts being physically dangerous. Let me be careful and precise here, friend, because this corner of Victorian history has collected a great deal of exaggeration, and the truth is grim enough without it. You may have heard that Victorian mourning clothes were dyed with arsenic. That claim gets repeated a great deal, and it is a muddle of two different stories. The arsenic story is real, and it is horrifying, but it belongs to green, not black. The pigment was copper arsenite, known as Scheele's green, and its brighter successor, copper acetoarsenite, sold as emerald green or Paris green. These produced a vivid, saturated color that nothing else could match, and the Victorians put them in everything. Wallpaper, paint, candles, children's toys, artificial flowers and leaves for hats and headdresses, ball gowns. There are documented deaths, most famously an artificial flower maker in London in 1861 named Matilda Schurer, who worked with powdered green arsenic dye and died at 19 after months of illness, vomiting green, with the whites of her eyes stained green. Her death was reported in the medical and popular press and became a scandal that helped drive arsenic out of consumer goods. That is the arsenic story. It is true, it is appalling, and it is not about mourning crape. What was actually in black crape is less lurid and, for our purposes, more relevant. Black in the mid-19th century was built primarily on logwood, a dyewood imported from Central America, along with oak galls and Valonia, and it was fixed with metallic mordants, principally iron salts, and, increasingly through the period, chromium compounds such as potassium dichromate. The fabric was then stiffened with gum, starch, or glue. None of that is arsenic. Some of it, particularly the chromium compounds, is nasty in prolonged contact, and potassium dichromate is a well-documented cause of severe contact dermatitis and, with repeated exposure, ulceration. Now add the physical behavior of the fabric. Crape sheds. The crimping and stiffening leave a loosely bound surface that gives off a fine dust with movement, and that dust carries the dye and the mordant with it. A woman in full crape is surrounded all day by a low cloud of her own clothing. And then add the veil, which is where all of this concentrates into something specific. The veil hangs directly over the nose, the mouth, and the eyes. It is the one garment positioned exactly across every mucous membrane in the human face. The wearer breathes through it for hours at a time, in all weathers, and when it gets damp from rain or from her own breath in cold air, the dye runs, and the dust becomes a paste. The results were reported at the time. Medical and popular publications through the second half of the century carried accounts of women suffering respiratory irritation, chronic coughs, catarrh, skin lesions around the mouth and jaw, and inflammatory eye conditions that, in the worst documented cases, progressed to serious and lasting damage to sight. The fashion magazine The Delineator commented on the subject in 1895, remarking that eyes which had survived the tears went on to be destroyed by the crape itself. There is a bitter economic twist inside this. Crape was expensive, and a great many women could not afford to be dressed in it head to foot, so they concentrated their spending on the items that mattered most for public display, which were the bonnet and the veil. An advice writer in the American periodical Arthur's Home magazine observed that women who could not really afford mourning bought it in the shape of a bonnet and veil. So the women with the least money were the women wearing crape closest to their faces and nowhere else. The cheapest way to comply with the rules was also the most dangerous way to comply with the rules. This is one of those details that changes the picture entirely. It is not that the rich suffered and the poor escaped, or the reverse. It is that the system distributed its harm according to how little you could afford to spend. Now, I want to be honest with you about the limits of what we can say. There was no Victorian public health study of crape mortality. Nobody was counting. The reports we have are clinical accounts, letters, editorials, and complaints in the press. And they established clearly that this was a recognized problem, discussed by doctors and by women's magazines. They do not let anyone produce a death toll, and you should be suspicious of any account that gives you one. What the evidence supports is that prolonged wearing of crape veils caused significant and sometimes permanent harm to the eyes, skin, and airways of an unknown but not small number of women. And this was known at the time and complained about at the time, and the custom continued anyway for decades. Which raises the obvious question: why? Partly because the harm was slow and cumulative and easy to attribute to something else. A widow with a persistent cough and inflamed eyes in the year after her husband's death has an obvious alternative explanation available, which is that she has been crying and grieving and not sleeping. Grief was expected to make women ill. There is even a strand of 19th century thought which held that a widow's visible physical decline was itself proper, a bodily testimony to the depth of her attachment. A woman who came through the first year of widowhood looking well was a woman who invited questions. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the most disturbing idea in this entire evening. Within the logic of the system, the fabric making her ill was not a defect. It was, to a certain kind of observer, corroboration. And partly the custom continued because of the sheer weight of the machinery behind it. Courtaulds had built an industrial empire on this cloth. Jays and Peter Robinsons had built department stores on it. The etiquette manuals were in every middle-class parlor, and they were revised and reissued and elaborated decade after decade. Manners and Rules of Good Society, one of the most widely consulted of them, was still laying out precise durations in its 1888 edition. 2 years for a widow, 12 months for a parent or a child, 6 months for a brother or sister, 3 months for an aunt or an uncle. 2 years for a widow, 3 months for an aunt. Written down, published, revised, and enforced not by any court or authority, but by every woman who read it and then looked at her neighbor. For Charlotte Ames, none of this is theory. In roughly 30 hours, a delivery will arrive at her door in Islington, and inside it will be a bonnet and a length of crape. And from the moment she puts it on, she will be wearing it in public for a year and a day. She will develop a cough in March that she will attribute to the winter. Her eyes will be sore through the spring, and she will assume it is from crying and from working at her needle by candlelight. And she will be partly right. And she will not take the veil off, because taking the veil off is not available to her. Let us go back to Islington. It is getting dark, and she has been out for 6 hours. She is home by 2:30, and the house has that particular flat quality of a place that has been going on without you. Ruth has the children in the kitchen. Emily is doing sums at the table because the school has been told she will not be attending this week. Thomas has been given a bowl of dried peas and a jar, and has been transferring one into the other for approximately 40 minutes, with an intensity that suggests it is the most important work being done in the building. Charlotte takes off her bonnet and gloves, and Ruth brings tea without being asked, and for about 10 minutes, the 4 of them are simply in a warm room together, and nobody is required to be anything. Then the afternoon begins, and the afternoon is where the isolation starts to become visible. Because here is what does not happen for the rest of this day, and for a great many days after it. Nobody calls. The rules of Victorian visiting were elaborate, and they had a specific set of provisions for mourning that everyone in Charlotte's circle understands perfectly. A widow in the first stage of mourning does not receive general visitors. Close family may come. Very intimate friends may come, briefly, and by arrangement. Everyone else leaves a card. They do not come in. They do not expect to be admitted. The card goes onto a tray in the hall, and the widow looks at the tray, and the transaction is complete. This is not unkindness. It is designed as consideration, and a good deal of it is genuinely considerate. A newly bereaved woman does not want to make polite conversation with 20 acquaintances. The card system spares her that while still telling her who has thought of her, and there is real humanity in the design. But look at what it produces when you extend it across a year. She does not attend church for the first month or so, and when she returns, she goes in veiled, sits, and leaves without lingering in the porch where the conversation happens. She does not go to dinners, because a widow in first mourning does not dine out. She does not go to the theatre, or to concerts, or to any entertainment whatsoever. She does not attend weddings. She does not host. She does not make morning calls, which was the entire mechanism by which middle-class women maintained their friendships, exchanged news, and arranged everything from schools to servants to marriages. Every social structure that a woman of Charlotte's class has access to runs through those channels, and every one of them is now closed for a year. The men around her are not subject to this. Edward's colleagues at the firm wore black armbands and black hatbands for a period, and then resumed their lives entirely. A widower in this same society is expected to mourn for something between 3 and 6 months, and even that is quietly waived if he has children to raise, on the sensible grounds that a man with young children needs a new wife, and it would be cruel to make him wait. He returns to his office the following week. He dines out. He is, within a season, an eligible man again. She has 2.5 years. He has a hatband. I have tried honestly to find the version of this that is fair, and I cannot construct one. The usual defense is that women's mourning was heavier because women's grief was understood to be deeper, and that the customs honored that. But you can test that explanation against the outcome. If the rules existed to honor the intensity of a widow's feeling, they would not have been so precisely concerned with what other people could see. The stopped clock, the covered mirror, the crape on the door knocker, the width of the border on the writing paper, the height of the crape on the skirt. Every single one of those is a signal aimed outward. The system was not measuring her grief, it was auditing it. And an audit needs auditors. Which brings us to the part that women of the period wrote about most bitterly. The enforcement was almost entirely female. Men set the broad frame of this society, but the detailed policing of mourning etiquette was carried out by women on other women with great precision and, in the surviving accounts, considerable relish. It was women who noticed that a widow had lightened her mourning 3 weeks early. Women who observed that a bereaved daughter's crape did not go high enough on the skirt. Women who remarked that a widow had been seen laughing in a shop, or had appeared at a concert in the 11th month, or had put on a grey dress before the calendar permitted it. The vocabulary that survives for these judgments is telling. A widow who moved out of mourning too briskly was said to be putting off her weeds with unseemly haste, and the accusation underneath it was always the same, and it was never really about clothes. It was that she had not loved him enough. Etiquette writers made this explicit. One widely quoted line from the period warned that it shocked people of taste to see a light-hearted widow jump straight from deep black into colors, as though she had been counting the hours. As though she had been counting the hours. Consider what that sentence assumes. It assumes that a woman looking forward to the end of a punishing and expensive and physically harmful regime is thereby confessing that her marriage meant nothing. It offers a widow one acceptable emotional posture and threatens her reputation if she departs from it in either direction, because a woman who mourned too long and too visibly was also talked about, as the Queen herself discovered when the criticism of her seclusion began to appear in the press. There was no correct amount. There was only the amount you would be judged for. And the policing ran downward through the household as well, which is the part that is easiest to miss. Ruth Pargeter, 19 years old from Bedfordshire on £14 a year, is also expected to be in mourning. Household mourning meant the servants too, and a household that could not or would not provide it was making a statement about itself that its neighbours would read immediately. So Ruth needs a black dress. And black is not a colour that a maid of all work would ordinarily own in a version fit to answer a front door in. Who pays for it is a question with an uncomfortable answer, because the honest answer is that it depends, and often the servant did. Mourning warehouses advertise specifically to this market, offering household mourning at rates described as a great saving to large and small families, which tells you that fitting out the servants was a recognized and budgeted expense in households that could afford it. In households that could not, the cost slid downhill. A maid might be given an old dress of her mistress's to make over. She might be advanced the money against her wages. She might simply be expected to sort it out, on £14 a year, from which she is very likely already sending something home. So the system reached all the way down. The widow bought crape she could not afford because her neighbours were watching. The maid bought or begged or dyed a black dress she could not afford because the neighbours were watching the widow, and the maid was the first thing they would see when the door opened. Nobody in that chain was free to opt out, and the person with the least money in the house carried the requirement with the fewest resources to meet it. Charlotte knows every part of this without being able to articulate any of it. What she experiences is simpler. She experiences an afternoon in a cold house where the blinds are down, in which nobody comes, and in which the loudest sound between 2 and 5 o'clock is a 6-year-old moving dried peas from a bowl into a jar. There is one caller at about 3, and it is not a social one. It is the man from the coal merchant, and he has come about the account. He is perfectly civil. He stands on the step with his hat in his hand and expresses his condolences, and then he mentions, in a tone of great delicacy, that the December account remains outstanding, and that he would not normally trouble Mrs. Ames at such a time, but that his own arrangements being what they are, he would be obliged if she could indicate when it might be convenient. The December account is £1 18 shillings, because December was the month Edward was ill, and there were fires in every room. Charlotte says that she will settle it by the end of the month. The man says that is very good of her, and thanks her, and goes. She closes the door and stands in the dark hall for a moment, and here is the thing she understands with total clarity and cannot do anything about. That man has been round to every house in the district where there has been a death this winter, and he has had this exact conversation, and he will keep having it, because a widow's credit is the first thing in the neighbourhood to come under quiet review. The tradesmen are not cruel. They are exposed. A household that has lost its income is a household that may not pay, and everyone in the supply chain knows it within a week. So while she has been told by every etiquette manual in England that her task for the next year is to withdraw from the world and grieve, the world has spent the afternoon knocking on her door about money. That contradiction is not incidental. It is the central one. The mourning system assumed a widow with means. Its entire architecture, the withdrawal, the year indoors, the wardrobe that cannot get wet, presupposes a woman whose material circumstances are stable enough that she can afford to disappear. For the women it was designed around, a small minority, that was true. For everyone else, and Charlotte is everyone else, the system demanded a performance of leisured sorrow from a woman who was simultaneously being pursued for £1 18 shillings by a coal merchant. She goes back into the kitchen and asks Ruth, as neutrally as she can manage, whether Ruth has family she could go to if it came to it. Ruth says she has an aunt at Luton. Neither of them says anything else, and the subject is understood to have been raised and postponed. At 4, it is properly dark. Ruth brings candles and lights the parlour fire, which they have decided to have today because tomorrow the delivery comes and there will be people at the door. At 5, they eat. At 6, Charlotte hears Thomas his reading. At 7, the children go up, and there is a bad 20 minutes with Thomas, who has been entirely cheerful all day and who falls apart completely at the point where his father used to come and say good night. Charlotte sits on the edge of his bed until he sleeps, which takes a while, and she does not cry, because she has discovered in the last 9 days that if she starts in front of the children, she frightens them, and being frightening is worse than anything. At 8:30, the house is quiet, and now she does the 2 things that are hers. The first is the housekeeping book. She lights a second candle, which is an extravagance she permits herself, and she opens it at the current page and enters the day. Omnibus, 6pence, both ways. J's, £18 7 and 6 on account. She sits and looks at that second figure for a while. Then she turns to the back page, to the list headed Mourning, and goes down it ticking items, and she finds that even after £18, there are things on it she has not bought. Black bordered notepaper, a second pair of gloves, mourning for Ruth, which she has postponed and which she will have to deal with within the fortnight. The second thing is the packet in the washstand drawer. She takes it out and unfolds the paper and looks at the lock of Edward's hair in the candlelight. It is brown, going grey at one edge, and it is slightly coarse, and it is exactly the hair she has been looking at across a breakfast table for 12 years. And she thinks about the jeweller's window on Regent Street and about why she walked past it. Part of the reason is money, and she is honest with herself about that. But it is not the whole reason, and the rest of it is harder. Hair work was enormous in this period, and it deserves to be understood properly rather than simply gawked at, because the gawking version misses what was actually going on. Hair does not decay. That is the whole point of it. In a century where the photograph was still new and expensive, where a middle-class family might own 2 or 3 images of a person in their entire life, a lock of hair was the only piece of a human being that could be kept, held, and touched. It was not morbid to the people doing it. It was the closest available thing to keeping someone. It was also a genuine domestic craft rather than purely a commercial product. Instructions circulated widely. Godey's Ladies' Book published tablework hair jewelry instructions in December of 1850, and thousands of women learned to do it at home, weaving strands over a small, weighted table in a process closely related to bobbin lace, then taking the finished piece to a jeweller to have the gold fittings made. Queen Victoria wore hair work throughout her life and exchanged hair work bracelets with the Empress Eugenie in 1855. And after Albert's death, she had the royal jeweller Garrard's make at least 8 pieces containing his hair. But there was a commercial trade running alongside the domestic craft, and the commercial trade had a problem, which is the thing Charlotte has half heard about and cannot stop thinking about. The demand for hair vastly exceeded what grieving families could supply, and hair was therefore imported in bulk. One 19th century authority on the craft, Mark Campbell, estimated that something in the region of 150 to 200,000 pounds of hair was imported into the United States in 1859 and 1860 alone. 200,000 pounds by weight. It came from peasant women in Europe who sold their hair for money, and it came from convents and from the poor and from anywhere else it could be got, which meant that when a family sent a precious lock to a commercial workshop with an order for a brooch, there was no guarantee whatsoever that what came back contained it. Working with a customer's small, awkward, possibly grey or brittle lock was slow and difficult. Working with bulk imported hair, sorted by colour, was fast. Contemporary sources are quite open that anxiety about this was widespread among customers, and that some jewelers advertised specifically to reassure clients that the hair returned would be the hair sent. Sources on the craft also record that coarser horsehair was sometimes substituted where a stiffer material was needed. So a widow could spend money she did not have on a brooch to keep her husband close to her skin, and wear it every day for 2 years, and be wearing a stranger. Charlotte has heard a version of this. Somebody said something at a card party a year or 2 ago, and it went in sideways, and stayed. And standing at that window today, with her £12 and her £18 bill, she found that she could not bear the possibility. Not because it would be a swindle, though it would be, but because she would never be able to know, and she would have to look at the thing every day for the rest of her life, and wonder. So she folds the paper back over the lock of hair, and she puts it in the drawer, and she keeps it as it is. There is one more thing on the mantelpiece in the back room, and she looks at it before she goes up. It is a photograph, taken in a studio in 1859, of Edward and Charlotte and the 2 children. It cost 15 shillings, and Edward complained about the price for a week. In it, everyone is stiff and slightly startled, and nobody is smiling, because the exposure was long, and holding a smile for that many seconds produces something worse than solemnity. It is the only photograph of him that exists. She is aware, distantly, that some families in her position do something else. Post-mortem photography was a real and reasonably common practice in this period, and it worked exactly as grimly as it sounds. The photographer was called to the house. The body was arranged, sometimes in a chair, sometimes with the eyes propped or painted onto the print afterwards, and the family posed alongside. For families who had never been able to afford a photograph while the person was alive, it was often the only image they would ever have of a mother or a husband, or most commonly, and most heartbreakingly, of a child. Nobody suggested it to Charlotte, because Edward had been photographed once, and once was considered enough. She has thought several times this week about what it would have been like if they had never gone to that studio in 1859, and about the fact that 15 shillings, which he complained about, is the only reason her children will know what their father's face looked like. She takes the candle and goes up. While the house is quiet, let us step back and look at where all of this was going. Because Charlotte is living inside a system at almost the exact moment of its greatest power, and systems at their greatest power are usually closer to the end than anyone inside them can see. Start with the woman at Windsor, because her decisions set the ceiling for everyone else's. Victoria was 42 when Albert died. She had been married for 21 years and had borne 9 children, and by every account, the marriage had been the organizing fact of her adult life. What she did afterwards was not a performance for the public, whatever else it was. She had his rooms kept as he had left them. She had hot water brought to his dressing room every morning. She had his clothes laid out. She slept with a photograph of him, taken on his deathbed, above the bed on his side. She wore black without meaningful interruption for 39 more years, until her own death in January of 1901. And she withdrew. For years, she barely appeared in public at all. She avoided London, spending her time at Windsor, at Osborne on the Isle of Wight, and at Balmoral. She refused to open Parliament in person for a long stretch. She resisted ceremonial duties of nearly every kind. The country's patience for this was not unlimited. By the later 1860s, there was open criticism in the press. Republican sentiment, never a major force in Britain, had one of its few genuine surges in this period, and it was driven precisely by the argument that the nation was paying for a monarch who did not appear. Pamphlets were published asking what the Queen was actually doing with her civil list. Someone is supposed to have pinned a notice to the railings of Buckingham Palace announcing that the premises were to let in consequence of the late occupants' declining business, which may be apocryphal, but which captures the mood exactly. So the woman whose grief set the standard was also, within a decade, being attacked for observing it too thoroughly. That tells you something important about the trap. There was no length of mourning that satisfied everybody, not even for a queen with unlimited resources and total control over her own household. Now look at what was happening beneath her, in the ordinary country. The mourning system reached its absolute peak in the 2 decades after 1861, and then it began to come apart. And it came apart for reasons that had very little to do with anyone deciding it was cruel. The first reason was money. The expense had always been the loudest complaint, and by the 1870s it had produced organized opposition. Funeral reform associations were founded in Britain, arguing for simpler and cheaper funerals and less elaborate mourning, and they made real headway. The argument they made was not primarily humanitarian. It was that ruinous expenditure on death was driving working families into debt and, in the worst cases, into the workhouse, and that a system in which a labourer's family might spend a month's wages on black cloth was indefensible. By the last quarter of the century, reform-minded writers were openly recommending that families adapt and re-dye existing clothing rather than buy new, which, 40 years earlier, would have been an admission of disgrace. The second reason was work. The mourning system had been designed by and for a class of women who did not work outside the home. It assumed a woman whose social existence could be suspended for 2 years without material consequence, because her social existence was not the thing paying the rent. As the century went on, more and more women's lives simply could not accommodate that assumption. Widows ran shops. Widows took in work. Widows became teachers and clerks, and later typists and telephonists. A woman who has to be behind a counter on Monday morning cannot spend a year and a day inside a house. The third reason was that the fabric fell out of fashion, and this may be the most human reason of all. By the 1890s, fashion magazines that had spent decades explaining exactly how much crape a widow required began to run pieces criticizing it, on grounds of health and on grounds of the sheer misery of the thing. The medical complaints that had been circulating for years finally caught up with the aesthetics. Women were advised to wear a light net veil instead, or to wear the crape veil thrown back over the bonnet rather than down over the face. Courtaulds, reading the market with the same clarity it had shown on the way up, moved its emphasis away from mourning crape and toward dyed silks, and eventually toward a new artificial fiber called rayon, and it survived into the 20th century as a textile giant on the strength of that pivot. And then the fourth reason arrived, and it ended the entire thing almost overnight. The First World War. Between 1914 and 1918, Britain lost something in the region of 700,000 men. The mourning system that Charlotte lived inside was built for a society where death arrived in ones, at intervals, into households that could organize themselves around it. It was not built for a country where nearly every street lost somebody, and many streets lost a dozen, and the losses arrived in telegrams over 4 continuous years. Full Victorian mourning became impossible for straightforward, practical reasons. There was not enough black cloth. There were not enough dressmakers. Women were working in munitions factories and on farms and in offices, doing the jobs of the men who were gone, and could not withdraw from public life for 2.5 years, even had they wished to. And there was a further argument, made explicitly at the time, that a nation covered head to foot in black would be a nation visibly demoralized, and that public mourning on the old scale was therefore bad for morale and something close to unpatriotic. So it stopped. And it did not taper off slowly the way these things usually do. The elaborate, codified, industrialized Victorian mourning system that had taken most of a century to build was effectively finished within a few years. And what replaced it was the thing we still have: a black tie, a dark suit, a single day, and then a general expectation that you will manage your grief privately and not make it anyone else's difficulty. Whether that is an improvement is a genuinely open question, and I do not think it has an obvious answer. Here is the case for the old system, and it is stronger than a modern listener expects. Victorian mourning told you exactly what to do. At the worst moment of your life, when your capacity to make decisions has collapsed, it handed you a complete set of instructions, covering what to wear, what to write, who to see, and how long it would last. It made your loss visible to strangers, so that the woman in the omnibus knew not to speak to you, and the shopkeeper knew to be gentle. It gave grief a defined shape and a defined end, and it built a community of the bereaved who could recognize each other on the street. Those are not trivial things. Anyone who has been recently bereaved in a modern city and has stood in a supermarket queue surrounded by people with no idea that anything has happened has felt the absence of exactly that. And here is the case against it, which is what we have spent the evening looking at. It was ruinously expensive, and the expense fell hardest on those least able to bear it. It was physically harmful. It fell overwhelmingly on women, while men returned to their lives within months. It removed a widow from public life at precisely the moment she most needed to rebuild it. And it converted private feeling into a public examination, marked by her neighbours, with her reputation as the grade. The Victorians took something true, which is that grief is real and ought to be honoured, and they built on top of it an apparatus so heavy that it crushed the people it was supposed to be honouring. For Charlotte Ames, in January of 1862, none of the reform associations exist yet. The fashion magazines have not turned, and the war is 52 years away. She is at the peak. She has the full weight of it. She has a year and a day of deep mourning ahead of her. Then something like 9 months of second mourning, when the crape comes off and the black silk goes on, and she may wear jet and a little ornament. Then 3 to 6 months of half mourning, when she may move into grey, and then into lavender and mauve and violet, easing back toward the visible world by degrees so gradual that nobody could accuse her of hurrying. 2.5 years, in a life that in 1862 might reasonably be expected to run another 30. She is 34 years old, and she will be nearly 37 before she is permitted to wear a colour. Let us gather up what we have watched today, because several patterns have been running underneath it, and they are clearer now than they were this morning. The first is the conversion of feeling into expenditure. Everything Charlotte was required to feel today, she was required to buy. Her sorrow had a price list. The depth of her attachment was measured in yards of crape, and the yards were purchasable, and therefore her grief was legible to any stranger on the street as a quantity of money. This is what makes Victorian mourning distinctive rather than simply old-fashioned. Plenty of cultures have mourning dress. What this one had was a mourning market, with a dominant manufacturer, a chain of department stores, published standards, an export trade, and a 30% return on capital. The feeling and the transaction had become the same object, and a woman who could not complete the transaction was understood not to have had the feeling. The second is the asymmetry, and I want to name it plainly because it is the load-bearing wall of everything else. 2.5 years for her, 3 months for him. She covered her face, he covered one sleeve. She withdrew from every room where her class conducted its business, while he was back at his desk on Monday morning. There is no reading of the evidence in which this is anything other than what it appears to be. The society had decided that remembering the dead was work, and that the work was women's work, and it assigned it accordingly, in the same spirit and by the same logic that assigned them the laundry. And the effect, whatever the intention, was removal. For 2.5 years, a widow was absent from the mechanisms through which her class conducted its affairs: the calls, the dinners, the church porch, the concert room. Those were not entertainments. That was where information moved, where positions were found, where introductions were made, where a woman with 2 children and £18 a year might have discovered an opportunity. Charlotte is locked out of all of it, in the year she needs it most, by a set of rules that everyone around her sincerely believes are there to protect her. The third pattern is that the harm was invisible by design, and I mean that more literally than it sounds. The whole system was built around what could be seen: the width of a paper border, the height of crape on a skirt, the stopped clock, positioned on a mantelpiece where a caller would look, and the veil, which is the perfect expression of the thing, because the veil exists to manage what other people see, and its cost is paid entirely by the woman behind it, in her lungs and her eyes and her skin, where nobody is looking. There is a version of that sentence for almost every element of this story. The mourning warehouse's respectability was visible. The Essex mill girls breathing dye fumes were not. The widow's correct appearance on Sunday was visible. The account she had opened to achieve it was not. Her composure was visible. The arithmetic at the back of the housekeeping book was not. The fourth pattern is one I have been circling all evening, and it is the one that makes this history uncomfortable rather than merely sad. Almost nobody involved thought they were doing anything wrong. The assistant at Jay's was not a villain. She was a working woman doing her job well, and she was probably kinder to Charlotte than most people would be that week. The etiquette manuals were written by people who believed they were helping the bereaved avoid humiliation, and they were, in a narrow sense, correct. The neighbours who watched the height of the crape believed they were maintaining standards of decency in a world that seemed to be loosening. Even Courtaulds, extracting an enormous margin from waste silk, was, in its own understanding, manufacturing a product that people urgently wanted and could not otherwise obtain. Cruelty that requires a villain is easy to understand and comparatively easy to stop. What we have watched today is the other kind. the kind assembled out of ordinary people following reasonable-seeming rules, each of whom is responsible for one small piece, and none of whom is responsible for the whole. That kind is much harder to see from the inside, which is why it lasted 80 years and why it took an industrial-scale catastrophe to end it. The fifth pattern is the one I keep coming back to, and it is about who was actually being examined. Read the etiquette manuals closely and you notice something. They are not really instructions for honoring the dead. They contain almost nothing about the person who died. There is no requirement to speak of him, remember him aloud, tell his children about him, or do anything he valued. Edward Ames, who read aloud badly and explained things without condescending and worried about money, is essentially absent from the entire apparatus that has organized his widow's next 30 months. Not one of the rules is about him. They are all about her, what she wears, where she goes, who she sees, how long she waits, and whether she gets it right. The Victorian mourning system was not, in the end, a way of remembering the dead. It was a 2.5-year examination of the surviving woman's virtue, conducted in public at her own expense, with her reputation as the result. And the dead man, in whose name every bit of it was done, had no part in it at all. It is a little after 11, and the house on the terrace is dark except for one window on the first floor. Charlotte has been sitting up in bed with a shawl over her shoulders and the candle on the table beside her, and she has not been reading, although the green Tennyson is open on the counterpane where she put it an hour ago. The street outside is quiet. There is a lamp at the corner, and its light comes through the gap at the edge of the blind and lies in a thin strip across the floorboards. Somewhere, a long way off, a dog is going at something. Once, around 10, a cab went past, and she listened to the wheels the whole length of the street until they were gone. Downstairs, Ruth is asleep in the attic room above her. Along the landing, Emily and Thomas are asleep in the back bedroom, Thomas on his front with one arm hanging off the mattress, Emily very straight, the way she does everything now. Tomorrow the delivery will come from Regent Street. Sometime in the middle of the day, a man will bring a large flat box up the 3 steps and knock the muffled knocker, and Ruth will take it in, and it will be opened on the parlour table with the blinds still down. Inside, there will be a dress of black parramatta with crape halfway to the waist, a bonnet, gloves, and a length of crimped, stiffened, light-absorbing silk, long enough to reach from the crown of her head to somewhere below her waist. She will put it on. She will go out in it on Sunday, to church, veiled. She will wear it for a year and a day. Then she will begin the long, calibrated descent through second mourning and half mourning, through black silk and jet and grey and dove and lavender, until sometime in the summer of 1864 she is permitted to appear in the world in a colour again, and everyone will notice, and nobody will say anything. Whether the household survives that long is not settled tonight. The assurance money may come through. Her brother in Norwich may help. Ruth may have to go. Emily may have to leave the school. Charlotte may end up doing what a great many widows of her exact class ended up doing, which is taking in lodgers, or teaching, or going back to Norwich to be somebody's useful sister for the rest of her life. The housekeeping book is downstairs on the table in the back room, closed, with the pencil laid across it. Tomorrow's entry has not been written. It will begin with the delivery from Jay's, and then the milk, and then whatever else the day turns out to cost. She reaches over and licks her fingers and puts out the candle, and the room goes dark except for the strip of lamplight on the floor. And that is the end of one day. Just one, in one life, in a narrow brick house on a terrace in Islington, in the second week of January, 1862. There were tens of thousands like her in that city alone that winter, and every one of them had a list, and a book, and an account to open, and a fabric to put on. Their names are mostly gone. What survives is the paperwork, The shop ledgers and the household accounts and the etiquette manuals and the advertisements, and here and there, in a museum case, an actual dress. The crape, long since gone brittle and browned at the folds, still refusing after 160 years to reflect any light at all. The fire has burned down to its last coals. The story is finished. But the people were real, friend, and they lived. And now you have spent an evening in their world. That is something worth having. Good night.